Hello and welcome to SQL in the City Streamed. I'm Kendra Little. I am a new technical evangelist for Redgate. And in thinking about the theme today of adapt and thrive, I thought back to when I started working in software because we've been adapting for a long time now. We are in the midst of a massive amount of change in how we develop and deploy software. And when I first started working for a software company, I was lucky enough to get a job at a little startup. And I ended up working in a team called Build Operations there. So I got to help make changes deploy to production. And when I first started there deploying changes, we would have our development teams, and we had more than a few. When I started, there were 7, and it was rapidly increasing. All of these development teams would create lots of changes for production, and we would bundle these up into groups that we would finally release to production every 3 months or so. And with this amount of changes flowing into production, we would do our best to test them in non-production environments before deployment, but it was very difficult. And also, just to get all of the changes deployed to our complex database system and our complex environment, we would need to take down the system and to have an outage for a weekend. This was a really big deal because we were a 24/7 business with customers around the world. On these weekend deployments, we would get all of the changes pumped through the system and processed, and then go into a big testing phase and have usually very tense go, no-go meetings at the end of the weekend because inevitably issues would be found that we hadn't expected. And in some cases, somebody who had a lot of historical knowledge of the system would figure out, oh, this is bad, but it's not a result of the change. This has been on our backlog for a long time. We can go forward because people are used to this problem. But it was very, very tense and difficult. It was hard on both those of us deploying the change as well as the customers who couldn't access any of our services throughout the weekend. We were also, at that time, at the startup, a pretty hierarchical organization. But it was a shallow hierarchy. There wasn't too many people between me and, say, the president of the company. But this changed in an interesting way. Now, as time went on, I went on to work for Microsoft Corporation. And oddly enough, this little startup was purchased by Microsoft Corporation. And we were part of the same family again, which a couple years after I first got to work with this team, I then transferred back over to work with them in the context of a larger corporation that had a deeper hierarchy and that had processes aligned with that hierarchy. And this was really interesting because by that time, a lot of adaptation had happened. The team got away from this waterfall of changes where things would be deployed to production only every few months. And we're breaking changes down into smaller chunks of changes that when I went back and joined them again, we were figuring out more and more. How can we keep things online by being clever about how we deploy these changes, even if we're deploying to the database? How can we minimize our impact on our users and continuously be deploying changes into the system? And we ended up in a situation where we wanted to plan and deploy changes at a small level, but because of the hierarchical nature of the organization, it was quite difficult. Because higher levels at the organization, they wanted to know, well, what are you going to achieve this quarter exactly? And how can we measure that afterwards? So we were trying to deploy small chunks of changes while having committed to something bigger and to the hierarchy. And this can get a little tricky because sometimes during the middle of deploying small changes, you get feedback from your customers and figure out they want something slightly different than what you were thinking about at the beginning of the quarter. It becomes very interesting to do this in a very hierarchical organization. We also had different teams in the organization reporting to different functions. So, for example, our DBA team is part of an IT operations team where our development teams were reporting into a different structure. And this made things pretty hard. And everyone's really busy. Everyone's doing a lot of work. But to be able to deploy these changes really frequently, I had to literally break out of my little DBA office in order to figure out how can we be the most clever about these changes and avoid downtime. I started going to stand-ups. Now, I couldn't go to stand-ups of all our development teams. At that point, we had 12 or more development teams. So among the DBA team, we spread out the tasks and developed specializations so that I focused on several development teams, but could still help out with all of the databases in the environment. And I could be at those stand-ups. Then, by making connections, by breaking out of that silo, I found I could help out before the problem happened and actually have connections with the developers where I learned a lot and they could learn from me across silos. I also found things changing during that time. When I first started as a database administrator, I had this vision of my career progression, and it was a traditional ladder vision of a career progression. My dream was to become a senior level DBA. And I had this traditional model of a career where we step up every few years, staying within our silo. And once I broke out of my little DBA office or my DBA cube, depending on what building I was in, I started to notice that there were a lot more interesting jobs that one could have that weren't just in the same title I'd once dreamed of having. And I realized that career progression was already kind of changing and that I shouldn't just limit my ideas about what my career could be to staying within that silo. I also found an interesting thing as we grew in that hierarchical organization where we're trying to plan big sets of changes at once. We're trying to do our planning in a way that conflicts with the way we continuously release changes, where sometimes along the course of releasing those changes, we discover we want to change track. We want to adjust some of those commitments that we've made because it turns out there's something better. Well, traditionally, we have leadership tracks and we have individual contributor tracks. And when I first started working in software, the nature of a leadership job was that you spent most of your time in meetings. And the nature of a contributor job was that you spent most of your time coding or designing or architecting. And sometimes people would switch between these tracks, but individual contributors who became managers were often frustrated because there just wasn't time for them to geek out anymore. Now, sometimes with adaptation, it's tricky because during this period of time where we're trying to release changes quickly, if the way that we are planning and committing to changes doesn't work well with that, what we can end up with is everyone being involved in a culture of going to meetings all the time, because it's the folks in development and IT, the folks on the ground who are making things happen, who really understand, are we going to be able to meet that commitment? And a lot of the leadership just constantly wants input and feedback. So if we aren't careful, adapting to this can be really tough. We want to figure out how to get our processes and how to get the things that we commit to, the ways that we measure success, in line with how we're actually delivering software as well. And in the present day, a lot of teams have gone through similar types of adaptation to what I went through with that little team that ended up joining a big company. The Redgate 2018 State of DevOps report has really interesting information about what are people doing when they deliver software in the present day. And that report has found that of the folks who answered the survey who have adopted DevOps practices, not everyone has, but of those who have adopted DevOps practices, 73% of them deploy database changes twice a month or more. They're not waiting for one release a quarter, one release a month. And of these folks who have adopted DevOps practices, 38% are deploying database changes more than once a week or daily. So they are able to get changes into the database on a regular basis and get value out to their customers in the form of bug fixes as well as new features. We have lots of things that we have adapted to. These days, we have jobs that involve titles I had never heard of when I first started working at, hey, let's deploy into production as much as we can. We have jobs in DevOps. We have site reliability engineers. And these are jobs that combine disciplines that used to be so separate. They combine the functions of IT operations and of developers. They help people crossing these boundaries help their teams deploy changes more quickly. And also, we have more tools that we can use to automate changes, to do more with our data when it comes to machine learning, when it comes to artificial intelligence. This number from the 2018 State of Database DevOps report just shocked me. I would never, ever have thought that almost half of organizations would have developers deploying changes to databases in production or anywhere in production, because these used to be such separate fields. This is even between the survey this year and last year. This is a 20% increase. So lots of change is flowing through our jobs, but not everything's easy. There's still a lot of difficult things. It's harder to be nimble when it comes to the database. And the report also shows that of all responders, this isn't just the ones who've adopted DevOps, of all the responders, only 52% of database development uses version control. Now, to me, even from those early days, getting your code into source control is one of the first most elemental principles of things we want to do, of good practices in software development, but people are still having a hard time doing it. And some of these people may have even started implementing some DevOps practices. This image is from the newly released DORA report on the 2018 State of DevOps. And this is a really interesting report as well. This graph just resonated with me so much because it shows that progress is not a straight line. When we start out in saying we want to release changes more quickly, we want to implement DevOps, we don't reach for the hardest changes first necessarily. We find places where we can automate more easily, and we tackle those, and we start to see progress, and we do reduce some manual work. But once we burn through that, once we're out of low-hanging fruit, then we start having cases where we see, oh, we need to do more testing, and we don't have automated testing for that yet, so we have an increase in some manual testing requirements now. And then we also get to more parts of the system where we have lots of complexity and it's much harder to work through it. It takes more time for us to make progress through it, and it can be a bit stressful working through that. Now, their study happily shows that there are lots of teams who make it through this and who get to a point where they have once again reduced the amount of manual work. It's gone back down now that they've worked through that difficult part of the transformation. But depending on the nature of your team, the amount of legacy code you have, and what you're working on, it can take some time to get there. And this can be stressful. There are other stressors as well. We need to not only work towards automating more, but we also need to constantly update our skills because new technology is coming out all the time. What should we use in the cloud? What should we use on premise? Do we use the word premise or premises? There's all sorts of different ways in which we need to learn things, and it's incredibly difficult to keep up. There's also a lot of concern and fear. Are we going to be on the front page because of a data breach, because we missed something in a new feature? And even, is this emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning, is this going to mean that I don't have a job? There are a lot of things that developers and DBAs and people in IT worry about now. So let's tackle some of these fears, right? We need to adapt and thrive, and part of this is getting past these fears. A study done in 2013, there's an academic paper called The Future of Employment, and they actually used machine learning to do a study on how likely different jobs are to be computerized. Now, at the end of this paper, which you can download online, there's a large table of all the different jobs with the probability that the job is to be computerized. And I've just taken a sampling from there. So at the high end, at the jobs that are most likely to be computerized are things like data entry keyers and umpires or referees. I'm not sure if I'm really thrilled about technical writers having a high probability of having their jobs computerized, but that is the result of the study. And when we look on here, if you look down at the probability of systems software developers for their job to be computerized, it's way down at 0.13. But this isn't even the low end of the probability. So if you're a system software developer, there's a very low probability that your job is going to be computerized. But adjust your scale, because for application software developers, the likelihood, the probability is even lower. For database administrators, it's even lower than that. But if you're really, really concerned, if you really want to make sure that you have a job for the next 2 decades, then according to this study, what you really need to be is a sales engineer, which I apologize to all the sales engineers. It's like the cockroach of all jobs. It is going to survive anything according to this study, the true resilient job. Now you may wonder, all right, so what is it that makes a job resistant to being computerized? Well, the folks who did this study did some summarizing, and other folks who are looking at how organizations are evolving and growing have looked at this too. And the more I read, the more I saw agreement that the traits that make a job non-computerizable and that make a job very valuable are creativity, critical thinking, and social intelligence. Well, what is social intelligence? It's the ability to persuade people. It's also the ability to listen well. These are the things that, as people who are part of developing and delivering software, we need to think a lot about these traits. And the more we can invest in these traits and the more that we can do well at this, the more value we will add to our company. Because changes that are happening aren't just changes to how we deliver software, they're also changes to how our organizations work. Our organizations are evolving as well. A really important change that we all need to bring into our organizations. This is important for C-level executives. This is important for managers. This is important for individual contributors, is we need to create a culture of learning all the time. Learning within our job. You don't just learn once a quarter. You don't just learn once a year when you go to a conference. Those are great. Those are part of your learning culture. But we need time within the week where we attend something like SQL in the City Streamed, or we have attended that and we say, hey, there's a session that I saw with Kathy on machine learning, and I think our team should watch that in the afternoon together and talk about just how we think maybe this is going to impact us or ways we might be able to do this in the future. Even as an individual contributor, you can try to make time for this. You can suggest this, build this into your week. If you have a review process, as most people do, set goals for, I want to learn about this topic, and make them measurable. Say, I want to learn about this topic, and my goal is to identify a way in which we might adopt something in this broad area that could impact the company, and I'm going to scope it. It doesn't have to be adopted, but your goal is to assess, is this something that could be useful to us? How much money might it save us, or how might it save us time and allow us to do more? And share that with the team, because these are the kinds of activities that make you more valuable to your company. And by pushing this into your review process, it helps build this into your job itself. In creating this culture of constant learning, part of this is updating that concept of career progression and not just saying, hey, my job is just to climb the ladder. Open yourself up to new responsibilities and new opportunities, because organizations that are studying the company workplace, they say we're moving away from this culture of just promotion upward. We're moving towards a culture where We work on different assignments and different opportunities. We take on and try out different leadership roles. The folks who develop human resource databases now, if you like to think about different data structures, they say the appropriate data structure for a company now, when we're thinking of an HR system, is a graph database where we focus on the relationships between items. And we aren't just confined to a single team under a single manager, but we have a lot of people we can learn from in our company, and we have more ways to evolve. Leadership is starting to be seen not just as someone who says to the company, this is the direction, we're going over there, and I want you to go this far by this date. But instead, leaders, effective leaders of teams who deploy changes, are identified as people who are catalysts, who empower their team to make more decisions within the team and to help determine the direction we're going. The leader's job is to help make that path smoother and more efficient. The role of executives now, part of the thing about that role that's seen now as important by studies on DevOps, by studies on corporate culture, is setting an atmosphere where risk-taking is encouraged and is possible. And you might think, okay, well, this sounds, okay, I'm a DBA. I don't like risk. My whole job is to protect the data. That's the essence of my job. The word risk, how do I mitigate it, right? You say risk, I say mitigate. Risk isn't just about rushing into new technology. There's the DORA DevOps report references an article written by Google, a blog post by Google, where they analyze what makes for effective teams at Google. And the ability to have a safe place to take risks was the #1 factor that helped make a good team. And how they define this is, if it's safe to take risks, then I am in an environment where I am much more likely to be able to admit, hey, I don't understand what you're talking about. Could you explain that? Or, I made a mistake and I think we need to address this. That makes for a much more effective organization. It also makes for an organization where we can criticize others safely and we can take criticism well. And it's not the end of the world to be criticized. For managers, if you're a manager watching this, I encourage you to read some of these reports and think about ways that you can get feedback from your team and encourage critical thinking and innovation in your team. One suggested method for this is to ask a simple question. How likely are you to recommend your job to other people? You can get a number back for this. You can baseline it with your team and you can measure it over time. This is a simple indicator of how likely your team is to be a high-performing team. For individual contributors, this is not the kind of change that we just wait for in our company culture. We need to also be a part of this. We need to suggest constant ways to learn. And the good news is, just by watching this live stream or watching the recording, you're already being a part of this. But we need to share it with others as well and see how we can influence other people in our teams to check out new ideas, because we can learn from them too. We don't have to learn everything new ourselves. We can encourage our team members to learn some of these things, and that they can assess, hey, is this something that would be valuable for us? So challenge yourself to find positive ways to take risks. Things as simple as looking at a process that we've been using for a long time and asking, hey, is there a better way we could do this? And not just doing it because we've done it that way for a long time. It may not be an immediate change we make overnight, but it can be a really valuable contribution that we make to the company. And in all of the sessions that we've got today, which are going to touch on the cloud, which are going to touch on machine learning and touch on career progression, look for ideas. Be open to new ideas and to growing. So welcome to the culture of constant learning, and thank you so much for joining us today for SQL in the City Streamed.